So you just heard an entire book of the Bible read. The shortest, just 25 verses. And it's a letter, as you heard, written by Paul to Philemon about Onesimus, who's a human being that's owned. It's a property of Philemon. And it's unique among all the New Testament letters because it was written to one person instead of to a community, such as the Ephesians or the church in Philippi. But though this letter was written to one person to address one issue, it was intended for the whole church that met in Philemon's house to hear it. And it might seem kind of like an obscure letter about an issue that was unique to its time, but it's actually a rather beautiful description of what it means to be in Christ as a person and as a church. So Paul is fond of the phrase in Christ and uses it a number of times, such as when he told the Galatians, in Christ there is no Jew or Greek. In Christ there is no male or female. In Christ there is no slave or free. And so in this letter, Paul offers a very concrete way for Philemon and Onesimus to live in Christ. But it depended on Philemon. And therefore, you heard Paul using his masterful rhetorical skills, attempting to persuade Philemon to accept Paul's request. So he began by calling Philemon his dear friend and praising him about all the wonderful things he's heard about what Philemon is doing. Flattery is a great place to begin. And while he praises Philemon, Paul calls himself just an old man, despite his exalted stature in the church. And then Paul gets down to business by telling Philemon he could simply command him to do what he's about to ask, but instead wants to appeal to him on the basis of love. And, with a voluntary good deed, you can be a hero. And so the issue. Onesimus, a slave who ran away from Philemon, whom Paul calls my child, my own heart, rightfully belonged back. But first, Paul praises Onesimus for being so useful to him in prison. It goes without saying, though he kind of does, Onesimus has been more useful than Philemon. Like, hint, hint, where have you been? And then the big ask, I could keep him here, but take Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, which is an odd way to put it, but more the point, a dearly loved brother. Welcome him as you would welcome me. Paul says, welcome him like you would welcome me, which means Paul made himself equal with Onesimus. And Paul promises, I'll happily repay you if Onesimus has caused you any economic hardship. It's a nice promise followed by, I won't say anything about how you owe your life to me, which is kind of subtle. And Paul concludes by praising Philemon again. I'm confident you'll do whatever I ask, because remember, you can be a hero. And finally, prepare a guest room for me, which means I'll be back to check to see if you've done as I've asked. And one more thing, he adds greetings from people who know that Paul sent this letter. Message, others are watching you too. So there's often a fine line between masterful persuasion and master manipulation. But behind it, bottom line for Paul, this is what it means to be in Christ. So you have to remember that Paul and his community were not in positions of power, except among themselves. They were a distinct minority in the Roman system of power and values, which included that some people were free and others were unfree. Domination was practiced by force, by violence, or simply by the inertia of this is how it's always been done, which sometimes is more powerful than any other influence. Remember, Jesus used to provoke authorities intentionally, oftentimes. But decades later, this minority didn't want to draw any attention to itself or rock the boat and catch the eye of the Roman authorities. It was understandable self-preservation, self-protection. And yet, to be in Christ is to be different. They couldn't help but live in direct contradiction to some values. In a culture that valued power over, the early church practiced radical equality. Not only that no one was better than another, but no one shall exercise domination over another, and notably of men and women, until they unfortunately began to mimic the culture around them. But Paul's message to the early Christians, those who are in Christ, are not to practice power over each other, whether free or unfree. So, from my place in history, I wish Paul had gone further and made a clear case that slavery is evil. That it might have been legal in the Roman Empire, but among Christians, I wish he had said it was absolutely forbidden, because one cannot, in Christ, own another human being. And it's the greatest betrayal of being in Christ that the church ever had anything to do with slaveholding or the justification for slavery, the remnants of which we still see today in movements for white supremacy. But my wishing that Paul had not accommodated the slavery of his day is like what will be said of me 100 years from now. I wish David had said, I wish David had done. For most of my ministry, for example, it's been involved in some form of food outreach, collecting food and funds for hunger centers and food pantries, working at or hosting shelters for people who are unhoused in our church. And here, the food distribution in our parking lot, uptown. So if I can criticize Paul for accommodating slavery in his time instead of condemning it, in 100 years I might well deserve criticism for accommodating the unequal world we live in. I mean, it may be asked of the church 100 years from now, how could you prop up such a system? The church should be upending inequality, not helping to perpetuate it. Just like I ask of our forebears 150 years ago, how could you help the government run Indian boarding schools? 150 years from now, people will be asking of the church, well, why didn't you do more about climate change? But how can we change things we don't control? So here's what Paul did. With this one personal letter treasured by the church, Paul abolished hierarchical relationships. Well, one relationship. But he modeled the radical abolition of unequal relationships. And not that Onesimus would be equal spiritually alone, but as Paul was fond of saying, in the flesh. How can we change things we don't control? We start with one relationship at a time. How can we change things we don't control? Well, it's not by forcing ideas upon people, but like Paul, with masterful persuasion. Paul could have told Philemon what to do, but instead loved him into changing his thinking. People won't agree with what we think are great ideas unless they first know there is a great love. Practice love until love is received, and then work for change. How can we change things we don't control? By joining forces. Not every movement for equality succeeds, but no movement began without someone daring to say, why don't we? One dream shared becomes a vision. And we know that people without a vision will perish. We start change by speaking up among the people with whom we are in Christ. That's something we can do. We can choose the power of good even while mired in systems of domination. In 1985, Riverside Church in New York City became the first open and affirming church in the UCC. My church in Denver was number 71. 6 years later. It took years, one slowly at a time, one relationship at a time, not by shame, but by the persuasion of love. And today, by declaring our vision of equality in Christ, there are now over 1,700 open and affirming churches, almost 40% of the UCC, and growing faster than ever. So Antoinette Brown was ordained by the Congregational Church in South Butler, New York in 1853. The UCC claims her as the first ordained woman in modern history. She quit 10 months later and became a Unitarian. That shows how much love she received. It took many more years, but slowly, so slowly, one courageous woman at a time. Now, more than 50% of pastors in the UCC are women, and a small, slowly growing number who are transgender. One relationship at a time, not by shame, but by the persuasion of love, a movement of people in Christ are changing the world. During Paul's time, the Christian minority walked a very fine line between two worlds. Christians today are not a minority. And increasingly, it feels like some of them want to practice a form of dominance over everyone else. Feels like it, and some downright say it out loud. It's not biblical. It's an ideological power grab. And within this environment, our progressive Christian voices can feel pretty small at times, but we do have Paul's clear call. As I read the letter to Philemon, to be in Christ means where there is dominance, to deconstruct the exalted authority exerted by men over women and people who are non-binary. Where there is dominance, to deconstruct systems that perpetuate power by white over people of color. Where there is dominance, to deconstruct the privilege of straight over LGBTQIA+. And where there is dominance, to deconstruct the blasphemy of Christians seeking supremacy over everyone else. Now, to deconstruct is not to destroy people, to consider them enemies or shame anyone into change. It is to love people. How do we change things we don't control? In Christ. One relationship at a time. How do we change things we can't control? In Christ. By the persuasion of love. How do we change things we can't control? In Christ. By joining together. And as we change ourselves, the love of Christ will change the world. And so, sing a new world into being. Sound a loud and hopeful theme. Find a tune for silent yearnings. Lend your voice and dare to dream.